Hi, and welcome to Tech Talk, the Banker's video series on everything FinTech. I'm Joy Macknight, Technology Editor at The Banker, and I'm here with Gabrielle Patrick, co-founder of Epiphyte. Gabrielle, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
There's so much buzz around blockchain. What does Epiphyte do in this area?
I think you're right. There is a lot of buzz in blockchain. There's a lot of hype in terms of this space. People see that it solves everything. It really does not. We at Epiphyte believe that it is very narrow in terms of scope and application, but very deep in its application. So the blockchain represents a replacement of the human element of trust. It represents digital trust. And this is what we do. We piggyback on the blockchain to provide faster, cheaper, more secure transactions using that component of decentralized trust.
Okay, and where do you see the most advances with blockchain within the, let's say, financial services industry?
In terms of bank movement or generally? I think this is a challenge because from the bank's perspective, they have very entrenched legacy systems. And here you have a technology which can be perceived as being at loggerheads to that centralized legacy structure. So for the bank's perspective, it is very challenging, but I think the real innovation and where we will start to see change, like any type of innovation which is not blockchain specific, is on the fringes. So niche services which the banks have not perhaps even thought of as yet. So for instance, places where it may be perceived that the banks have abandoned as not part of their traditional offering anymore. So remittances to the underserved, places where there's a perceived issue with capital controls, for instance, Venezuela and Argentina, peer-to-peer lending. These are areas where there's a perception that the banks are not doing enough. And I think this is where the innovation will be best served. And what we will see, very similar to the internet, is that development of innovation on the fringes, where innovation usually happens. And it will work its way towards those core systems.
So do you think that it will be able to really replace those core systems in the future, or do you think that it will be almost like a system running alongside?
I like to be very practical. I think in our present-day society, they must be very symbiotic and work in parallel. But I do think that there's a possibility in the future where there will be a replacement. I think it's a long road to get there. But again, you know, innovation is not always a very clear or straight path. I think there will be spurts and starts. We will see little flickers of something very sort of revolutionary in terms of its offering, and then eventually it will transform. So I think, you know, change is hard. It's not blockchain specific, and it takes time. I think time, you know, with time everything will work itself out.
How did you really come into the FinTech community?
My road to Epiphyte really came into being because for a very long time, I was very fascinated with the concept of virtual currencies. You know, this thing in an in-game environment that you could trade and possibly pay for, and you could get these fancy smancy things with it. I thought that was very fascinating. So when Bitcoin became popular in 2012, you know, to the masses, depending on how you look at it, I didn't quite understand it, but I thought it was fantastic that I could use this thing to be paid and to use stuff with it. I thought that was, you know, quite fantastic, but I didn't really understand the technological perspective. And so, you know, at that time, it was a relatively small community, and so we all knew each other, and then Epiphyte sort of naturally blossomed. At least my role in Epiphyte naturally blossomed from there.
Excellent. And obviously with new technology like blockchain, how can the regulators really keep up with the pace of change?
I think the primary way is for regulators to understand that regulation at core, in my opinion, is addressing regularization of standards or services or activity. But innovation is the opposite of that. It's irregular because we don't know what we are going to build or how it's going to be delivered or what the offering is going to be or the data we're going to collect from that offering. And so I think it's of utmost importance that regulators create a safe harbor environment for small companies, for startups, so that they can innovate without fearing the consequences that they are offering can go wrong. So for instance, in the UK, the UK and the FCA is leading in its regulatory sandbox efforts in terms of providing tools to small companies so that they could try to test their market, test their offering in the market without fear or retribution of these consequences, which would apply usually to larger authorized companies. I think that's primarily important. I think the other aspect that regulators should look at is, specifically for blockchain, is the ability for them to use this as regtech. This is something that I don't think is talked about enough. But here you have a technology which allows for increased transparency and programmable tracking, which didn't exist before. I think regulators are used to institutions reporting to them, but here you have an ability where they could have visibility and access to almost vast amounts of data. So I think those are the 2 points that the regulators need to look at.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Gabrielle.